Hello, and welcome to JDI Coaching and my first series of parts tips. I'm going to do 30 parts tips over the next 30 days and do one every single day. And I'm going to keep these relatively brief. I'd like to keep them around 5 to 10 minutes tops, 10 minutes. And I'm gonna start with some of the basic information. So if you watch this and you're like, oh, that's like I learned that 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I got it. I'm going to have some more advanced tips towards the end, but I really wanted to kind of start from a basic framework and then move myself upward. So if you're watching this one, this is tip number one. And like I said, there'll be more to follow, and I'm going to delve into some pretty fun and exciting stuff, some things that maybe you hadn't thought of, and throw some things out there I've seen some other people do that maybe a little bit off the beaten path as it is. So I'll come into a parts department, find a very senior manager who knows what he's doing, been doing this for a while, and yet these system settings are not where they need to be. So the first one we're going to talk about is the critical setting of phase in and phase out. Now, quite simply, the phase in is basically at what point during the part number's life cycle, at what point during its time in our system do we want to actually bring that part in and put that part on the shelf for sale? And then at what point, after that life cycle is over, at what point do we want to take that part and return that part back? And the general school of thought that's probably been around since before myself is 3 and 12. And a lot of you guys have probably heard it. Oh, my phase in is 3 and 12. My phase out is 3 and 12. But some people don't truly understand what that means. For most systems, most DMS systems, a 3 and 12 phase in means it needs 3 months worth of demand, not 3 demand. So it gets confused a lot of times with 3 sales. I've heard even technicians say, well, this is the third time I've ordered that this month. We need to get one. Now, 3 in 1 month would definitely get my attention, but doesn't necessarily mean that that part's going to be a stocked part. It may just be an artificial rush. I'm going to take a look at that part number, but not something that I'm going to automatically pull the pin on and put it on the shelf. There's a reason why they want to see 3 months of demand, because they want to look at the demand curve and make sure it makes sense, right? Make sure that this part is not going to be something you're stuck with and is not going to become obsolete. So what it's looking at is 3 months of demand over a 12-month period. So as long as it sees, it can be sold in, let's say, January, one in March, and then one in November for that matter. And now you have 3 in a 12-month period, and boom, that part would be qualified for stock, and that part would be on its way to you if you ran a regular stock order. Then phase out. Now, phase out, most places, most people, they go 3 and 12 in and 3 and 12 out. So then basically coming out, they want less than 3 and 12. And that has changed over the last 10 years or so. And they've gotten a little bit more aggressive. Meaning us as parts departments across the country, and the general wisdom around this thought is moving that to 0 and 6. And the theory behind that is once the part has sat for 6 months with no demand, no activity whatsoever, then it's pretty much on its way to obsolescence. It's like a 65% chance that part's not going to sell. So that means that it's going to be stale no matter how you look at it. So what you want to do is after 6 months, you really want to start phasing that out. So let's say you have one on the shelf. It's been 6 months, it hasn't sold. You want to give yourself another 6 months to get it off the shelf. And that way, outside 12, which is where most of us measure obsolescence, which I will get to later on in the month. Once it gets past 12 months, now you can, hopefully you've sold it and you don't have to send it back. And you can reduce your obsolescence or your returns to your manufacturer. So that's my best piece of advice for you. My tip number one is, first of all, check and measure your settings. And if you have multiple sources, which is also a thing I'm going to get to later on, I'm going to talk about sourcing and lost sales, and I'm going to talk about pricing, and there's a lot of things to come. But this first one to me is the baseline where everything starts, is when should the part come in? So if you haven't looked at your phase in and your phase out in a while, or you inherited the parts department from somebody else and you just assume maybe that it's set up right, I would go in and check those settings. A lot of times guys add sources and then they use that source. Let's say they add an aftermarket source and they decide they're going to use that source for something else. And now the phase in, phase out criteria in that source is not set up correctly and nothing's going to really happen in there. So you want to make sure that that those are set up correctly and that you're not getting parts before you want to get them in. You're not buying obsolescence and you're not phasing things out too late or maybe even too soon. Now I had a parts manager who had a bumper cover on the shelf. It had not had any activity in 11 months. His phase out was set to 3 and 12, so it needs to get to that 12th month before it will make a determination. The part was on month 11, and they actually sold the part to a body shop. Then it reordered the part because it's in month 11, right? So it says, hey, look, we're supposed to have one of these on the shelf. So the system looks out, reorders the part, and the part comes back in and it goes on the shelf. Well, it rolls into month 2 or month 12, and the part goes into, auto phase out, right? So it's going to go into the phase out category where it's not going to order it again, the system. And then the body shop returned the bumper cover. And so now he's got 2. So now he's got 2 sitting on the shelf that are basically obsolete. We're going to have to send back. So that's an extreme case, but I just want to use that to exemplify why this is such a critical component, why you want to go and check those system settings. So right now, if things are slow and during our time of pause right now, it might be a good time to go in and clean up this setting. So go in and look at your phase in, phase out. Now, on the advanced side of this, you can create different phase in and phase out depending upon the source. So, for example, if you want to try to up your level of service or fill level to the shop, which is another metric we're going to talk about, if you want to up that, a good way to do that is to change your phase in on low dollar items and get a little bit more aggressive on that. So you can go down to like 2 and 12, and that'll bring parts in a little bit sooner. On low dollar parts, it's not going to elevate your inventory dramatically, but it will put those extra pieces on the shelf that you can actually sell. In addition to that, you can also scale your phase in back a little bit. So if you go 3 and 9, you can get a little bit more aggressive. Now you're only looking at a 9-month window. So that means if on month 10, if you get that third demand, it's not going to stock the part, right? It's looking at a 9-month window. So that's a way too. So in a lot of cases with daily stock orders now, and some manufacturers are doing multiple orders a day, you might be able to pull your inventory back. But just understand, if you get less aggressive on your phase in, your fill off the shelf rate could come down a little bit. And we're going to talk a lot about that in one of my tip sections, because that one to me is critical. I might spend 2 or 3 different tips on that one, but that one's a very, very critical component because that's where most of your margin is going to come from. So you want to be careful with that. So I would start with the basics. If you're just starting out, 3 and 12 in, 0 and 6 out if you can, and then kind of watch your inventory, continuously measure your fill off the shelf rate, and see if you need to adjust that a little bit either way. If you're doing multiple sources, which again we're going to talk about later, and I'll go into more depth in terms of phase in, phase out on the multiple sources. But if you are doing that, you can kind of change up your phase in, phase out based on the type of source that you have. So hopefully that's not too much for this first one, but hey, go back, check your phase in, phase out, make sure that you're set up right, make sure you're getting the right part on the shelf, and I'll see you here with my next tip. Hey everybody, G-Man here. I want to say thank you for watching this video, and I hope that you got something out of it. If you did, if you got any value at all, please like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube so you can stay up to date with all the content that we're bringing out. And if you have any questions at all or you need help with anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Leave a comment on Facebook or YouTube, or you can email us, Gary@jdicoaching.com, and we'll get right back to you. Thanks again.